"You're no longer the mother of my child." I said those words in a near whisper, and I watched the color drain from her face. For a split second, her lips parted, as if trying to shape a protest, but nothing came out. She just stood there, in the dim light of our living room, shaking. Her nails, perfectly manicured, tapped against the side of her phone. Some part of me registered that detail coldly, that even now, she was taking care of her appearance, as if that could protect her from what was coming. I could feel my heart pounding, more from adrenaline than fear. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't anything. Just months ago, I would have found it impossible to say those words to her. Back then, she was my wife, the mother of my 2 kids, the woman who used to snuggle beside me on lazy weekend mornings with a coffee and a half-smile. But that was before I discovered how deep her betrayal ran. Before I realized just how calculated she had been, how she'd set me up to die, collect the insurance, and escape with a man who called himself an attorney but played more like a con artist. I stood in front of her, letting the silence stretch. It felt like a chasm between us. On the table next to me lay her laptop, still open, the screen dark now, but glowing faintly whenever a new message arrived. That laptop and the messages it contained had turned my life upside down. She tried to speak, her voice catching once, then breaking free in a half-choked whisper. "Jack, what are you talking about?" I turned slightly away, my eyes darting to the framed photos on the wall. Our wedding day, her white dress, my stiff grin. My parents, long gone, smiling from the edges of the picture. And of course our kids, one big happy family, an illusion. I remembered the day we took that photo, the way she fixed my collar and made a playful face at the camera. I remembered how I felt so proud, so sure we had built something to last. But illusions shatter. Sometimes all it takes is a single small crack. Sometimes you come home one afternoon, earlier than expected, and find the smallest clue. Or maybe you notice a certain smell in the house, something that doesn't belong. Like cologne you never use, trailing through your bedroom. It's faint, but it lingers, especially on the sheets. A heavier, almost musky note that reminds you someone else has been where they shouldn't be, where only you should have been. And if you brush that aside, because you don't want to make accusations, you might see other signs. Maybe you hear her humming in the kitchen, more cheerful than usual, or catch her with a secretive glow on her face. She's cooking borscht, or something else that takes time. So she can hover near the stove with her phone out, reading messages, cheeks flushed. The tension in your chest grows. You tell yourself you're paranoid. You want to trust her. Until one day you see that open laptop, an accidental invitation into a world you never imagined. Messages pop up. You can't resist. You read them. And that's the moment your entire foundation cracks. I closed my eyes and let the memory surge. I just stepped into the house, a little earlier than usual, as she ladled soup into a pot. I remember the tangy aroma of beets and cabbage. At first I smiled. Borscht was not something she cooked often. The door from the garage was still swinging shut behind me when I saw it, her laptop perched on the kitchen counter, the text window open. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice I was there. I heard the familiar ping of an incoming message. Then another, and another. Her posture changed. She leaned in, hungry for those words. The steam rose around her, but she didn't take her eyes off the screen. I crept closer, the adrenaline beginning to burn in my veins. When I was within a few feet, I recognized the email icon, the subject lines. They were short, cryptic, but the names, hers, his. The lines about meeting times, references to private consultations, a note about the signature we need. And then, further down, explicit lines. Things you don't say to a coworker unless you're crossing every boundary. She must have felt the shift in the air. Maybe the warmth of my body behind her, or simply the tension that rolled off me. She turned, startled. For a split second, she tried to minimize the window, but it was too late. Our eyes locked. Hers widened in silent horror. That was the day the illusions fell apart, but not completely. I didn't know the worst of it yet. That knowledge came later, over days and weeks of reading more messages, digging deeper, seeing each plan spelled out. She had a step-by-step strategy. Poison me, stage it as an accident, some allergic reaction, or an accidental overdose from my medication, something a half-decent coroner might overlook if the crime scene looked normal enough, then cash in on my life insurance. She'd already scouted houses in Montenegro, of all places, with the man she called my bald clown, Gary, the lawyer who straddled the line between attorney and con man. I spent nights lying awake, reading her words, forced to absorb them in raw detail. How she'd slip something into my drink, how she'd weep convincingly at the funeral, how she'd collect the payout, then vanish overseas with him. They'd planned the timing around some alleged business trip of his, so their disappearance wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. It was all laid out like a twisted itinerary. The humiliation I felt as a husband was like a fist pressing into my rib cage. But I said nothing. I didn't confront her outright. I had two reasons for that. One, I was so shocked I couldn't function in a normal way. And two, I realized I needed time. Time to think, to prepare, to plan something else entirely. Now, as she stood before me in the living room, I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes because she sensed the tide had turned. I walked toward the couch and sank down slowly. My voice was steady as I said, "Sit." She hesitated but complied. The tension in the air was so thick you could slice it with a kitchen knife. "Jack," she began, "look, I don't know what you think." "I know everything," I cut in quietly. "I've read every message, every single one. I know about Montenegro. I know about the poison. You don't have to pretend anymore." Her hands fluttered near her lap, fidgeting, searching for some anchor. I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Had she even bothered recently? The last time I'd seen it on her hand was probably months ago, but I hadn't registered the significance then. She swallowed hard. "Jack," she started again, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I kept my gaze on her, letting the silence expand. I wanted her to feel the void. I wanted her to drown in it, because I was done being the naive husband. I was done giving her the benefit of every doubt. I let the silence stretch to a breaking point. Then I said, "You have 3 minutes. Then I'll walk out, and everything will be different." "Wait," she breathed. I could see her eyes darting around, searching for a lifeline. Maybe she was trying to figure out if I had proof or if I was bluffing. Maybe she wondered if there was still a card she could play. Some spark of the old confidence flickered in her. She raised her chin. "Jack, I messed up," she said, forcing out each word. "Gary, he was just. Look, it was a mistake. I got in too deep. But I never would have really. I mean, I was angry. I was frustrated. We were drifting apart. I felt invisible. You barely touched me anymore. It was just talk. We were just venting fantasies. It wasn't real." She tried to push out a tear, but it hovered at the corner of her eye, refusing to fall. I almost laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound that caught in my throat. "Not real," I repeated softly. "Sure. The documents you emailed him with the insurance details, the photos you took of my prescriptions, the money you started stashing. All that was just a dream, right?" Her face tightened, and she looked away. The pretense of innocence was wearing thin. "That's enough," I said. I stood, my legs feeling like lead but my mind razor sharp. "I'm going. Don't follow me. Don't call me. Don't call the kids. You'll get a chance to explain yourself to them soon enough. But I'm done talking to you." She started to stand, but I shook my head, and the coldness in my expression must have stopped her. She sank back down, biting her lip. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. "Away from here," I said. And I meant it. I grabbed my jacket. I was still wearing the same jeans and shirt I'd had on when I came home from work. I didn't even bother changing. I just needed to leave that space, that moment, behind me. As I walked out the door into the cold night air, I felt the strangest clarity. The sky was overcast. Faint streetlights cast halos on the pavement. Our porch light flickered. My car was parked in the driveway. I got in and turned the key. I didn't look back at the house. In my mind's eye, though, I could see her silhouette in the window, frozen, desperate, maybe plotting her next move. I drove away, uncertain of my destination, only sure that I needed distance. For a week, I crashed at a cheap motel. I told my boss I needed some personal time, an unpaid leave if necessary. He didn't argue. I'd worked there long enough that they gave me some leeway. My phone buzzed constantly at first, but eventually I blocked her number. I only kept lines open to my kids. They texted me worried. "Dad, are you okay?" From my daughter. My son's messages were fewer, more stoic, but I could sense the confusion, the tension. I gave them both vague reassurances. "I'm sorting things out. Love you. Will explain soon." Those nights in the motel, I barely slept. Not from heartbreak or from longing for her. No, that had curdled into something colder. I was a swirl of anger, betrayal, and a twisted sense of relief. At least now I knew the truth. I had a laptop with me, and I spent hours going through her files, screenshotting the messages, copying everything to a secure drive. I studied them like a detective. I reread, memorized. The line about "just slip it into his dinner. He's so clueless, he won't even notice" lodged in my mind like a splinter. That was the woman I'd lived with for over 2 decades. The woman who kissed my forehead when I was sick, who gave birth to our children, who promised to be there, in sickness and in health. All those memories turned rancid, but I kept my emotions in check. I needed to think clearly. This was no longer about heartbreak. This was survival. And yes, retribution. I discovered more about Gary, too. Full name: Harold Gary Hudson. Middle-tier attorney at a firm with questionable ethics. I recognized the name of the firm, had some past professional dealings with them. The messages between him and my wife were a heady mix of dirty talk, illusions of grandeur, and blatant criminal conspiracy. They'd played with fire. Maybe they assumed I was too soft to notice or resist. Maybe they were counting on my ignorance. They forgot that I spent years working around bureaucracies, that I knew how to navigate official channels, how to push the right buttons. One phrase from their emails stood out: "I can handle any blowback from the authorities if things go sideways." Arrogant. Stupid. Perfect. I found a target for my first blow. The woman I once called my wife. And the second, the attorney who was so sure he was untouchable. After that miserable week in the motel, I called my kids and arranged for them to stay with my sister for a bit. I needed them safe, away from the crossfire. I fed them some excuse about the house needing renovations, some mold problem that required them to vacate. It was a weak story, but I could tell they sensed a deeper problem. And they didn't pry too hard. They were teenagers, old enough to read tension, but still dependent on our broken home. I also made a few calls, setting gears in motion. I had contacts in local government, in the state attorney's office, and in the local IRS division. They knew me as a straightforward guy, someone who never made trouble, but also never turned a blind eye to corruption. When I provided them with the digital files, bank statements, suspicious client details Gary had boasted about, transcripts of questionable deals, they perked up. This was more than your average workplace affair. This was bribery, forgery, tax evasion, you name it. Still, such cases don't move overnight. They take time, especially if the suspects have a network behind them. So I waited, quietly. I returned home after that week, found her standing in the kitchen like a ghost. She'd done her hair, her nails, as if to greet me with some facade of normalcy. She started to speak, but I raised a hand to stop her. I said nothing more than, "I'm back for now. Don't try to talk about anything that matters. Those days are gone." My silence was a fortress, and she banged against it in desperation. In the following days, she tried various tactics: anger, tears, seductive glances. Once, she came into our bedroom wearing a thin nightgown, her hair framing her face in just the way I used to find irresistible. But all I saw was the memory of her messages, describing how she'd watch me slump over, foam at the mouth, how she'd wipe her prints from the glass. The next morning, I packed a spare bag and stored it in the trunk of my car, just in case. She cornered me one evening and said, "Let's go to the theater tomorrow night. We have those tickets. Please, Jack, just for a night. Pretend we can get past this." Her voice quivered in that carefully measured way, balanced between hope and fear. Once upon a time, I might have softened, but that man was dead. I nodded, wordless. She looked surprised. Maybe she thought it was a sign of surrender. Or maybe she sensed I was planning something but didn't dare guess what. The next evening, I dressed in a decent shirt and slacks. Nothing fancy. She took her time, carefully doing her makeup, choosing jewelry. She had a knack for presenting herself elegantly, the perfect wife for social outings. Once I prided myself on that. I used to enjoy how others invite me. How naive I was. Before we left, she approached me. "Could you help me with this necklace?" she asked softly. It was a thin chain, simple, but with a tiny inscribed lock as a pendant. She turned her back to me, lifting her hair. The smell of her perfume washed over me. Familiar, once comforting. Now it felt suffocating. I gently closed the clasp around her neck. She glanced at the mirror, smiling a little. "Thank you," she said, as if believing we were sharing a tender moment. We arrived at the theater, and she pretended we were a normal couple. We took our seats. She placed a hand on my arm during the performance, testing to see if I'd push her away. I didn't react. I stared at the stage, my mind far from the bright lights and dramatic voices. When it was over, I drove us home in silence. The tension in the car was thick. She tried small talk. That second act was powerful, wasn't it? She got no response. Back at the house, she tugged my sleeve before I could vanish upstairs. "Could you stay down here with me tonight? Just watch a movie or something." I watched her for a moment, scanning her eyes for any trace of the woman I once loved. All I saw was someone spinning illusions, so I walked to a shelf in the living room where I'd prepared a small box. I handed it to her with no introduction. She furrowed her brow, pulled off the lid. Inside was a paperback. She lifted it out, flipping through its pages. "What's this?" she asked, her tone somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "You said you wanted something to read," I replied flatly. She started to speak but froze. It was too obvious that my gift was hollow, an empty gesture. It wasn't even the right genre. It was some old crime novel I found cheap at a second-hand store. "Jack, are we okay?" I shrugged, my face impassive. Then I left the room. I heard her toss the box aside, heard a shaky laugh slip out of her. Maybe she thought I was cracking, that she had a chance. She had no idea that the real plan was already in motion. Over the next month, I watched from a distance as her lover's world began to collapse. Carefully, methodically, the authorities built their case. They questioned clients. They took statements from partners in the law firm. Gary's boss, a tough bastard named Mr. Holden, wasn't about to let himself go down. He had resources, and the moment he sensed a real threat, he turned on Gary to save his own skin. The rumor was that Holden provided the investigators with files of Gary's side deals, which spelled out bribery, blackmail, tax fraud, everything. I wasn't present when they raided Gary's office, but I heard about it. The hush around the firm, the partners avoiding eye contact, the shock on Gary's face as they took him away in cuffs. I could imagine him trying to call my wife, maybe leaving frantic voicemails. They got me. "Don't talk to the police." But I told her not to speak to him anymore. She tried to call him a few times, I think, but never got through. He was gone. That's all that mattered to me. When the news reached her, she was frantic. She paced the house, phone in hand, tears smearing her mascara. She thought it was all some terrible misunderstanding. "Jack," she pleaded, "they arrested him. They're accusing him of awful things. You have to help me talk to someone. Maybe your old contacts in the city. I mean, he's still our friend." I stared at her in disbelief. The nerve. She wanted me to fix the destruction of her murderer and training boyfriend. But then again, I recognized the desperation in her. She was clinging to the fantasy that all could be salvaged, that she could still find a way to escape, or to keep her life from crumbling completely. I let her words hang in the air. Then I walked past her without a word. The next day, I informed her she was no longer authorized to use our joint accounts. I locked her out of our finances. I changed the passwords. She shrieked at me, threatened to call a lawyer. How ironic that she still thought lawyers were on her side. I told her calmly, "Try it. Let's see how far you get." We existed in an uneasy stalemate for a while, until the day of our anniversary came. 22 years of marriage, a mockery of love. She seemed to have forgotten the date, or maybe she was hoping I would. But I set the table for a family dinner that evening. I wanted our kids there. I told them in a group text, "Be home by 6. Family dinner, no excuses." They both responded with cautious curiosity, but they came. The 4 of us sat around the table. My son asked, "Is everything okay?" My daughter picked at her plate, silent but observant. My wife had put on a fresh blouse, though her hair was unkempt. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. She could barely muster a forced smile. "Kids, your father wanted us all together. Let's just enjoy a meal." We ate in uneasy silence, the air thick with tension. I forced a few bites, not tasting anything. When the main course was done, I stood and said, "Evelyn, we have something for you." She frowned, glancing at the kids. I reached into my pocket and placed a small jewelry box on the table. My daughter looked surprised. My son narrowed his eyes. My wife's hand trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a thin chain with a lock-shaped charm, the same one she'd had at the theater, only now the lock was engraved. I saw her lips part as she read the inscription on the tiny clasp. "Traitor." She gasped, fingers flying to her mouth. The kids looked confused. "Dad, what's going on?" my son asked, pushing his chair back. I didn't answer him. I set down a ring next, a wedding band, and flicked it across the table so it landed in front of her plate. She stared at it, stunned. Then I leaned forward, my voice so quiet I'm sure they all had to strain to hear. "Tell them," I said. "Or I will." She looked from me to the kids, and I saw her face go pale as paper. "Tell us what?" my daughter asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her eyes darted wildly. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Then, in a voice choked with shame, she began to explain. She stammered out fragments. How she'd been having an affair, how it spiraled out of control. She avoided the words poison and insurance, but I interjected calmly. "Say it. All of it." She wept, her voice cracking, describing how they planned to fake an accident, how she was desperate for money, how she'd lost faith in our life, how she blamed me for not giving her the status, the wealth, the fantasy she wanted. My daughter's cheeks streamed with tears. My son clenched his jaw, eyes blazing. By the time Evelyn finished, she was trembling so violently she could barely keep upright in the chair. "Kids," she croaked, I'm so sorry." My son erupted, "You're sick." He stood, fists clenched, uncertain whether to shout or run from the room. My daughter slid her chair back, tears still falling. "Dad, is this real?" she asked, voice trembling. I nodded once, painfully. That was enough. My son bolted from the table, cursing under his breath. My daughter followed, sobbing. Evelyn slumped forward, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, the only sounds were her ragged breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I let the silence stretch once more, the same way I had the day I first confronted her. I wanted her to feel the weight of everything she'd done. Then I stepped around the table. She looked up, eyes puffy, makeup streaked. From now on, I said, you'll pack whatever you can carry. You'll leave. This marriage is over. You will find your own place. The kids know you're poison. I don't care if you try to manipulate them further. You won't. Because they saw you tonight for who you are. You want to plead your case. Do it somewhere else. You want to cry about money. See how far that gets you. She tried to protest, but I raised my hand again. No, you did this. This is the consequence. I'm done. She let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp for air. I stepped back, my expression merciless. Get out. I said, I don't want you here. The kids will stay with me until they decide what they want. If you try to fight for custody, we'll bring all of your messages to court. I've got them saved in 5 different places. Don't think for a second you can deny any of it. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking with sobs. Part of me felt a flicker of something, maybe pity, but it was smothered by the memory of her plan to watch me die. A week later, she was gone. No job. Her position at the law firm evaporated after the scandal. No money. Our joint accounts were locked, and I'd frozen anything she might have tried to siphon off. No friends, once the rumor spread about what she'd done. The neighborhood closed ranks. And no name, at least none that carried any respect. She ended up in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, living off the scraps of what little she had managed to hide, and the minimal monthly allowance I was legally forced to give her until the divorce was final. We didn't speak unless it was about the kids' schedules, and even that was rare. Gary, meanwhile, was fighting multiple charges. Word had it his boss sold him out to save the firm. The bald clown had no one left in his corner, least of all my soon-to-be ex-wife. She had never been truly loyal to him anyway. She was loyal only to her fantasies of comfort and escape. The day after she left, I sat on the back porch with a mug of coffee. The morning sun cut through the trees, warming my face. For the first time in months, I breathed freely. I sipped, thinking about everything. The heartbreak, the rage, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. But she was wrong about one thing. I wasn't clueless. I just took my time. And I made sure that when I struck back, I left no room for doubt, no room for her to slip away. She thought she was playing a game. Let her think that. Because in the end, I wrote the final line. I watched it all burn down, from Gary's smug face to her carefully manicured dreams. And as I listened to the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze, I felt that sense of calm vengeance that's so much colder, so much deadlier, than any fit of rage. Days later, she tried to call me one last time. Maybe she thought tears and apologies would win me over. Maybe she thought the man I used to be would come to her rescue. I let it ring. Then I sent her a single text. You have 3 minutes, then I'm turning this phone off. Speak. She called again, right away. This time I answered. I heard sobbing. She tried to weave a story of regret. She blamed Gary for everything. She said she never would have gone through with the plan. She asked to come back, to at least see the kids, to just talk. I listened in silence for a minute or two, until her pleas turned repetitive and her gasps for pity became too shrill. Then I hung up, blocked the number. That was it. She never got her 3 minutes in full. The divorce hammered the final nail in. The judge heard her half-hearted testimony, looked over the evidence I provided, and probably felt sick to his stomach. She got nothing but the absolute bare minimum mandated by state law. I gave no arguments, no pleas for lenience, no anger in the courtroom. Just the facts. The truth was heavier than any performance she could muster. She left with her head down, escorted by a friend of a friend, because she had no one else. Now, months later, I still drink my coffee on the veranda in the early mornings. Sometimes my children join me. My daughter, Macy, is quiet but healing. My son, Tom, has grown a new layer of determination, focusing on scholarships for college. We're still a family, minus one. I never wanted them to learn about betrayal in such a brutal way, but life doesn't always spare the innocent. And as for my wife, no, my ex-wife, she's struggling to make ends meet in that shabby apartment. She doesn't come around. Our children visit her occasionally, out of pity or obligation, but I doubt that bond will ever be the same. She's no longer the woman who gave birth to them. In my mind, that woman died the moment she agreed to poison me. Now there's just the shell of what used to be. I should feel satisfied, I guess, but all I really feel is a kind of quiet acceptance, like all the illusions are gone, and I'm standing in a clearing, free to breathe. There's no more daily lie, no more second-guessing if the woman beside me is plotting my downfall. Whatever bitterness remains, it's overshadowed by this newfound calm. Tonight, I walk out the door again, stepping into the night. The porch light flickers behind me, and in some imagined, cinematic sense, I can see how a camera might try to follow, capturing the final expression on my face. But it won't follow me, because I'm done with that story. I'm done letting the past define every step I take. Before I shut the door on that chapter once and for all, I recall the last thing I said to her in person. She was on her knees, tears in her eyes, begging for forgiveness. And I remember the quiet steel in my voice as I pronounced the sentence she'd earned. From this moment, you're nobody.